Hello, good afternoon. I'm Bernadette Ardelli, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies, and I'm very happy to be hosting you today. Brandon University has campuses on Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 lands, and we are a gathering place for people from many backgrounds and around the world. In this way, we carry on the Indigenous customs of our home in Brandon. We acknowledge Brandon is on shared territory between the Dakota Ayote, the Anishinaabe, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Today, many other Indigenous people call Brandon their home, including the Ininu, the Anishinaabe, the Denesuline, and the Inuit. The plants, animals, and people who share their history and traditions on the land and water of this area deeply influence our gatherings today. Thank you to all for sharing this space with us. I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce you to a very special group of people who have traveled a long way to be with us today. First, I would like to introduce Brazil's Vice Minister of Indigenous Peoples, Dr. Eloy Terena. I would also like to introduce you to the delegation from the ministry accompanying Dr. Terena, Kaique Galicia, Ayrton Gasparini, and Dr. Ana Alfanito. I extend my gratitude to Dr. Terena and his colleagues for traveling here and to all of you for joining us this afternoon. It is my hope that this visit marks the beginning of a friendship and partnership that grows in strength over the years to come. Brazil and Canada share recognition of the richness and resilience of Indigenous knowledge, culture, and traditions. Across our two nations, Indigenous peoples have safeguarded languages, practices, and ways of knowing that continue to guide us in building more sustainable and inclusive societies. Research partnerships between Brazil and Canada provide a powerful opportunity to honor this heritage. By strengthening Indigenous led inquiry, we can create space for knowledge that is rooted in respect, reciprocity, and community priorities. Together, we confront shared challenges, whether in climate change, health, education, or cultural preservation, with approaches that blend innovation and tradition. Most importantly, these collaborations affirm the rightful place of Indigenous voices at the center of discovery and decision making. They advance self determination and reconciliation while also setting a global example of solidarity and mutual respect. In doing so, Brazilian and Canadian partnerships not only enrich our scholarly communities, but also contribute to a more hopeful future for all peoples. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Eloy Terena. Dr. Terena currently serves as Vice Minister in Brazil's newly established Ministry of Indigenous Peoples. President Luiz Inácio da Silva, also known as Lula, selected him for this position based on his academic training, leadership skills, and strong support from Brazil's indigenous movements, where he is widely respected. Dr. Terena is a member of the Terena indigenous community in Mato Grosso do Sul. He was educated at the Dom Bosco Catholic University, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and the Fluminense Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. Dr. Terena completed postdoctoral studies in France at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He holds 2 doctorate degrees in anthropology and law. Dr. Terena, a 2019 Brandon University recipient of the Emerging Leaders in the Americas program, conducted part of his doctoral research at Brandon University under the guidance of Dr. Wilder Robles from the Department of Rural Development. Dr. Terena recently received Brazil's most prestigious award, the Order of Rio Branco, for his remarkable work in establishing the first indigenous ministry in Brazilian history. Additionally, he received an honorary degree from the Dom Bosco Catholic University. Today, Dr. Terena will discuss exploring Brazilian and Canadian research partnerships for the betterment of Indigenous peoples. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Brazil's Vice Minister of Indigenous Peoples, Dr. Eloy Terena.
I'm just going to make a very brief organization how this, because it's tradition in indigenous community to share everything and do things together. So this presentation actually is going to have the participation of the 4 members of the community. That's why they're here. Obviously, Eloy is going to give the framework of the partnership, what it is, what the challenges are. Anna has elaborated some of the critical issues that they identify to establish potential partnerships. And Kaike and Gasparini, they are the technocrats who make the wheels move. So that's what at least I experienced when I was in Brazil. And it's an enormous pleasure to be here, actually. I met Eloy in 2011 when I was working at University of Manitoba, and I got a big grant from the CIDA, Canadian International Development Agency. There was a program called Students for Development, which is about taking Canadian students for 3 months to Brazil, living in indigenous community, learning about. It was rather fascinating experience, indeed. And the community we are going to visit was Eloy community. And my helper from the university said to me, oh, there are plenty of hotels around that community. Don't worry about it, And we got there was absolutely no hotels. So we had to be driving like 2 hours from Campo Grande to the community. And I said, this is not going to work at all. So I'm in trouble here. But Eloy somehow came to me when I was at university and offered actually to host it in his mother home, which is a very traditional indigenous home with so many rooms. And all my students were happy. The mother, who I still have enormous affection for her, the grandmother, they cook for us actually cassava, fried cassava, beans. We had so much vegetables. It was really fascinating experience that we had it. But the project ended, and as another project, I lost touch with Liz until 2018. I got a message from Antonio Carlos, the anthropologist at the University of Rio de Janeiro, and he says to me, Walter, do you would you like to supervise one of my students are doing a lot of things indigenous movement, and you might be the ideal candidate. And when I see the name, I say, oh, my goodness, I lost in touch with him. Obviously, I wrote it right away. He put the proposal, and he came to Canada in the winter. You see, it was minus 25, I believe, at that time. But we had a wonderful experience here, and I'm happy he completed his PhD, went back to Brazil when the COVID it was starting here, and he went to France, and I'm happy to have him as a colleague. He's no longer a former student. This is my colleague now, and which is actually I do. So I'm going to stop here and let him to talk, following diplomatic rules, because actually he will be speaking in Brazilian Portuguese. Anna will be translating, because actually, if you probably know, the former foreign minister, I believe, is from the European community, used to speak in English when his native Spanish is, and he got into trouble because he couldn't express what he wanted. So they blame actually him for the. So I want to avoid potential linguistic challenges, but Anna is an excellent translator. She will be translating here.
Bom, muito boa tarde a todos e a todas. Eu estou muito feliz de estar retornando aqui após 6 anos de minha estadia aqui na Brandon University. Quero agradecer, em primeiro lugar, ao professor Robbins pelo convite, estarmos aqui depois de mais de uma década de estar na minha comunidade indígena, e saudar todos os professores e convidados na pessoa da vice-presidente, professora Bernadette, também.
So Eloy says that he's so very happy to be here again after 6 years that he was here for the first time. He would like to thank Professor Robles for the invitation to be here, and he acknowledges that it's been over a decade since the professor was at his home in Mato Grosso do Sul, in his village. So this is a very, very happy encounter.
Bom, eu sou Eloy, sou do povo Terena, um povo que habita o bioma do Pantanal, sul-mato-grossense, que fica na região centro-oeste do Brasil, e faço parte de uma geração de jovens indígenas que nas últimas décadas no Brasil tiveram acesso ao ensino superior. Há 20 anos atrás, durante o período do governo Lula I, eu estava saindo da minha aldeia e indo para a universidade por meio das políticas de ações afirmativas implementadas pelo presidente.
So Eloy says that he's part of the Terena people, which is an indigenous people from the Pantanal wetlands. It's the name of a wetland region in the Brazilian Midwest, in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. And Eloy says that he's part of a generation of indigenous youth that first had access to the university system. So 20 years ago, Eloy was leaving the village where he was born and where he grew up to go to the university for the first time in his family, through a public policy, an affirmative action public policy that had been instituted by government Lula at the time to ensure access also of indigenous peoples to higher education. So this is kind of the generation to which Eloy belongs.
E o período que eu passei aqui, né, na Brandon University, não foi só um período de estudos, na verdade. Eu considero que foi um período de refúgio acadêmico, porque foi justamente num período em que o Brasil estava sob o governo de Jair Bolsonaro. E foi um período que os povos indígenas foram muito perseguidos, foi um período que o movimento indígena foi muito perseguido. Então, a minha vinda para cá, né, para Brandon, naquele momento, foi muito estratégico, foi muito importante e representou um ganho não só para mim, mas também para os povos indígenas do Brasil, porque todo o trabalho que eu fiz aqui como advogado à distância refletiu em muitos ganhos políticos e judiciais para os povos indígenas do Brasil.
So he wants to say that the period that he spent here 6 years ago was not only a period of academic production and research, but it was also a period in which he needed to seek refuge from the government of former President Bolsonaro in Brazil. So he had to leave Brazil for this reason, also seeking a safe place, because Bolsonaro at the time was going against and going after indigenous leaders and indigenous movements. So it was a dangerous time in Brazil. And everything that Eloy did here was not only important for him, but it was important for the indigenous movement more broadly, because there was a lot of political work, a lot of legal work that he managed to achieve because he had access to this place.
Por isso, quando o professor Robbins nos convidou, eu fiz questão de vir novamente a esta casa, né, para a gente construir, articular cada vez mais apoio para os povos indígenas, por meio de pesquisas, por meio de projetos, por meio de trocas de experiência entre os povos indígenas, porque nós entendemos que esse é um investimento que não só atinge um indivíduo, mas também toda uma coletividade, né? Então, nós temos pensado muito no Brasil de como continuar apoiando, como continuar fortalecendo, como continuar investindo no futuro dos povos indígenas através da universidade.
And so these are the reasons for which when Wilder invited us to be here again, invited Eloy to be here again, he immediately accepted the invitation, because he understands that this is a place where he can construct connections and exchanges and learning processes that go far beyond any one leader or any one people. And it's really about all the collectivity and the indigenous peoples and the indigenous movements. And one of the challenges that they're tackling in the ministry today is really how to build these movements and the strength through the universities and through research.
Bom, durante o período que eu estive aqui, nós enfrentamos muito esse processo de perseguição. Eu me lembro que foi o momento que nós tivemos no Brasil o maior índice de criminalização de lideranças indígenas, o maior índice de assassinatos de líderes indígenas, especialmente localizados na Amazônia brasileira, e foi o primeiro ano do governo Bolsonaro em que se pegou fogo na Amazônia de forma descontrolada, né? E eu me lembro que, estando aqui na Brandon, nós tivemos que nos conectar, né, com os povos indígenas do Brasil para poder pensar uma grande articulação política e jurídica para poder frear todos esses ataques que estavam acontecendo no Brasil.
So again, the period that he was here 6 years ago, indigenous peoples were facing systematic attacks in Brazil that were also attacks promoted by the federal government. So this was a period of high rates, the highest rates of criminalization of indigenous leaders, of threats, of the murder, of execution of indigenous land defenders, territorial defenders. It was also a time in which the Amazon was on fire in unprecedented levels. So being here in Brandon, Eloy was also connected to what was happening in Brazil, and he was able to think about political and legal strategies to address all of these pressing challenges that were taking place.
Mas hoje vivemos novos tempos, né, no Brasil. Nós tivemos eleições no Brasil em 2022 e o movimento indígena lançou um projeto chamado Aldear a Política, que era justamente garantir a presença de líderes indígenas nos espaços de decisão, né? Elegendo a bancada federal indígena, elegendo deputados indígenas, participando efetivamente, né, da equipe de transição do presidente Lula para construir um inédito Ministério dos Povos Indígenas, e foi com essa intensa mobilização, estratégia, alianças importantes que nós conseguimos sair de uma situação de perseguidos, né, em seu próprio país e alçar espaços importantes. Então, hoje, pela primeira vez na história do Brasil, nós temos um ministério que é comandado por uma ministra indígena, a Sônia Guajajara. Pela primeira vez também na história, a FUNAI está sendo presidida por uma mulher indígena, que é a advogada Joênia Wapichana. E pela primeira vez também nós temos uma Secretaria Nacional de Saúde Indígena, que está sendo comandada por um secretário indígena, que é o Veibe Itapeba, que também é um advogado indígena.
But today the times are different in Brazil. So the indigenous movement put together a process of demanding what Eloy called here aldear a política. Aldeia is the name of indigenous communities in Brazil, the villages. So aldear a política means to take the indigenous villages into political institutions, to make political institutions replete with the logics of indigenous communities and livelihoods, to guarantee the presence of indigenous leaders within institutional sectors of the state, such as the legislative branch, but also the executive branch. So indigenous leaders and representatives took part in what's called the transition government, that transitioned from the formal presidents to the Lula's presidency in 2023. And they participated in putting together the structure of the government. And so for the first time, we have an administration that has a Ministry of Indigenous Peoples that is led by Minister Sonia Guajajara. We have a National Foundation for Indigenous Peoples, FUNAI, whose president is today Joênia Wapichana. And we have a National Department for Indigenous Health, which is also headed by an indigenous leader. So this is all completely novel in Brazilian history.
E então nós tivemos pela primeira vez no Estado brasileiro os povos indígenas elaborando e executando a política indigenista. no Brasil. E nós chegamos lá com alguns desafios, né? O primeiro, que era retomar a demarcação das terras indígenas no Brasil. Vocês precisam saber que no Brasil hoje nós temos mais de 1.200 procedimentos de demarcação de terra indígena, e desses, cerca de 40% ainda estão pendentes de demarcação. Então, nós temos muitas terras demarcadas na região da Amazônia brasileira, mas nós temos ainda um passivo a ser resolvido, e esse passivo está justamente no Nordeste do Brasil, no Centro-Sul e no Mato Grosso do Sul, que é o meu estado, onde tem muita violência. Então, a primeira coisa que nós tínhamos que fazer é retomar a demarcação das terras indígenas no Brasil. A segunda era proteção territorial. Isso porque o governo passado deixou os povos indígenas totalmente desassistidos. Eu acho que vocês ouviram falar do caso do povo Yanomami, que estavam sofrendo com o genocídio, com a presença de garimpeiros dentro de seus territórios. Então, nós tínhamos que retirar os invasores das terras já demarcadas. E assim nós fizemos com Munduruku, Yanomami, Munduruku, Kayapó, né? E a terceira grande missão nossa era fortalecer a política indigenista, fortalecer a FUNAI, porque ela, o principal órgão de proteção dos povos indígenas no Estado brasileiro, foi totalmente desestruturado nos últimos 10 anos no Brasil.
So today, again, for the first time, we have this ministry or department in the state which is in charge of implementing the Brazilian Indigenous policy. And when they assumed office, it was a very challenging situation, because we have to remember that during the previous 4 years, so from 2018 to 2022, all the structures within government that protected and enforced Indigenous rights had been dismantled and destructured and defunded. So the challenges were enormous. Eloy mentions 2 of them. The first challenge was to start demarcating Indigenous lands again. Land demarcation is a process through which Indigenous lands are recognized and titled in Brazil, and it had been stopped through the previous years. So there was no demarcation policy anymore in Brazil. 40% of Indigenous territorial demands still have to be answered by government today, so there's a significant amount of work to be done demarcating lands, especially in the Central-South, in the Northeast, and in the Central-West of Brazil. So we have a lot of lands demarcated in the Amazon, but the rest of Brazil is also Indigenous land. And in these regions, there's a large deficit. So his ministry restarted the demarcation policy. And second, territorial protection. So the previous government had left Indigenous groups within their lands unassisted and had allowed invaders to go into these lands. So this means that the government of today had a large challenge in removing illegal invaders who are doing illegal mining, for instance, in the Yanomami lands or in the Munduruku lands or in the Kayapó lands. So removing these illegal invaders and ensuring that Indigenous groups had full access to their lands. And third, actually, he mentioned strengthening FUNAI, which is a National Foundation of Indigenous Peoples, his third challenge.
E ainda nós temos muitos desafios em relação aos povos indígenas no Brasil, né? A demarcação é uma delas, porque mesmo a Constituição Federal de 1988, que é a nossa Constituição brasileira, ter garantido o direito originário dos povos indígenas, ainda nós temos várias interpretações jurídicas, especialmente no âmbito da Suprema Corte Brasileira, que nós precisamos ainda superar para poder garantir esses territórios. Vocês sabem que no próximo mês de novembro, o Brasil vai sediar a COP30, e nós estamos trabalhando para, nessa COP30, ter a maior e melhor participação dos povos indígenas, mas essa participação ela tem que ser qualificada, né? E o que nós estamos querendo, o que nós estamos levando? Que a política para os povos indígenas seja incluída como uma meta na política climática. Demarcação de terra indígena, proteção territorial, respeito ao direito à consulta prévia, né, dos povos indígenas em todos os atos governamentais e não governamentais que forem lhes afetar. Então, esses são alguns dos desafios que estão postos na questão territorial, na questão da educação escolar indígena, na questão da saúde indígena, que nós temos ainda muitos desafios, e na efetiva participação dos povos indígenas na elaboração das políticas públicas. Foi longe.
But several challenges still remain today. So the demarcation, so the recognition and the titling of indigenous lands is still a significant challenge. The Brazilian Federal Constitution of 1988, which is our current constitution, has a legal category which is originary right. So the Constitution says that indigenous groups have an originary right to their land. This means that this right is previous to the legal order itself. It comes before the legal order. It should have precedence over all other rights. But this category is very disputed today and very attacked by anti-indigenous sectors. And so there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that the federal constitution is enforced and implemented to its full extent. Another challenge is to ensure a significant and meaningful participation of indigenous groups in COP30, which will be held this year in Belém, Pará, as you know. And so here, one of the goals of the government and of the ministry specific is to ensure that indigenous policies, and above all, territorial protection, demarcation of land, respect for free, prior, and informed consent, are considered climate policies, so that there's a convergence and a recognition from leaders and civil society around the world that protecting indigenous rights is to protect the climate. And Eloy mentions other challenges and other areas in which they're trying to advance, which include indigenous education, indigenous health, production and technologies for the protection of land, amongst other areas.
E uma das perguntas que as pessoas sempre nos fazem, né, quando a gente expõe a realidade dos povos indígenas do Brasil, é como nós podemos ajudar, né? Isso é uma pergunta fundamental. E os gestos, né, de apoio aos povos indígenas, eles são de várias maneiras, né? Desde você se posicionar favoravelmente aos povos indígenas, que isso já é um ato muito importante, especialmente em localidades em que os povos indígenas ainda sofrem com racismo. Mas aqui no âmbito da universidade, né, nós estamos muito interessados em fortalecer os nossos laços, né, acadêmicos, pensando projetos para que os povos indígenas possam também, a partir de suas cosmovisão, a partir do seu conhecimento tradicional, a partir das tecnologias presentes nas comunidades indígenas, a gente possa pensar como todo esse conhecimento científico pode estar a favor dos povos indígenas, seja na defesa dos seus direitos, seja na proteção dos seus territórios, seja no desenvolvimento sustentável dessas comunidades indígenas, que tanto buscam também por autonomia. Então, eu quero deixar aqui, né, essa principal mensagem nossa, né, em nome do Ministério dos Povos Indígenas, mas também em nome, né, dos povos indígenas do Brasil, das organizações indígenas, essa abertura para que a gente possa fortalecer, né, esses laços e que a gente possa sair daqui pensando coisas concretas voltadas para os povos indígenas e nessa relação entre Brasil e Canadá. Isso para nós é fundamental. Foi muito?
Foi ótimo, André. And so he'd like to also say a few words about a question that always arises, you know, when he encounters people who are supporters of indigenous rights and the indigenous cause, that people tend to ask, you know, how can we help? And to this question, he wants to say that, you know, at any time, positioning oneself in a favorable manner and supporting manner towards indigenous groups is already a big step. especially in the context that we're living in today, where Indigenous peoples in so many places are under attack. But specifically concerning the university system and academic spaces, he wants to say that he finds it very important to strengthen the academic ties between, be it Brazilian academic institutions or governments, and other academic institutions around the world that can help us understand how knowledge and science and data and information can be generated and used to strengthen Indigenous groups through their knowledge systems as well. So in a true vein of intercultural knowledge production, and how this intercultural knowledge and science can be used to respond to some of the challenges that we're facing. So he wants to say to leave this opening for us to strengthen academic ties and academic research projects, and to strengthen the ties between Brazil and Canada in this sense.
Bom, e eu gostaria de finalizar mais uma vez agradecendo, né, este momento da gente estar aqui com vocês. No primeiro momento eu vim sozinho, né? Hoje eu tive a oportunidade de trazer outros amigos, a Ana, o Kaique, o Gasparini. Agradecer ao professor Robles, né, por essa parceria de mais de uma década, né? O professor tem mais de 12 anos, eu acho que o senhor foi na minha comunidade, e desde lá a gente tem construído muitas coisas positivas, e é importante a gente enxergar isso, né, que não foi só uma bolsa para o Eloy, né, mas que a bolsa do ELAP, ela proporcionou todo um ganho coletivo, né, que o período que eu estive aqui de estudo resultou também em coisas positivas para os povos indígenas do Brasil. E se hoje nós temos no Brasil um ministério, políticas públicas que estão sendo construídas em diálogos com os povos indígenas, é resultado também desses investimentos acadêmicos que nós fizemos, né? Então, o nosso time lá na universidade é um time também acadêmico, né? Todos nós somos indígenas com formação, com pós-graduação, e eu acho que isso já é fruto de mais de 20 anos de investimentos que nós temos feito, e vocês também fizeram parte disso. Então, quero agradecer mais uma vez a oportunidade de estar aqui com vocês, mais uma vez a oportunidade de ser recepcionado por vocês, e que isso tenha uma duração muito grande, que a gente possa ter outras e outras agendas, outros e outros projetos, e que outros indígenas possam ter também a oportunidade de vir aqui, estudar aqui, conviver aqui com vocês e voltar para suas comunidades com conhecimento para defender os seus direitos. Então, muito obrigado. Então, tem que traduzir.
So to head towards the end of his keynote, Eloy wants to just thank you all once again, to thank the university for inviting him once again to be here, to say that for the first time he came on his own, and he's very happy to come back now with his friends, which are us from the delegation. We're also very pleased to be here. He wants to say that the scholarship, the ELAP scholarship that he received, he wants to stress this point that it was a collective endeavor. So it was not a scholarship that served just Eloy, but many things were enabled because of the support, and many paths were constructed because the support was given. So if today there is a ministry, an Indigenous ministry, and today he's building these policies, it's because he was able to trail this path. And so he's very grateful, Robbins, he's very grateful for being here, and he hopes really that other Indigenous students who have the opportunity to be here, he hopes that new agendas and new projects will emerge from this partnership.
Thank you. Que vai conduzir agora, né?
Anne is going to briefly speak about some identified areas already, the partnership.
I can. Well, yeah, Eloy has said everything. What can I say after that? But yeah, Hobbes asked me to just say a few words about some possible research agendas or fields of knowledge production that could usefully be co-constructed between the Brazilian Ministry or Brazilian institutions of higher education and the university here in Brandon. And I mean, I would say that the list is really very extensive. So there's a lot of appetite and need for a lot of knowledge production. In this vein that Eloy mentioned here, which is really intercultural knowledge, so knowledge systems coming together to produce solutions and to ask questions together without hierarchies between local knowledge and university scientific knowledge. Speaking to Eloy earlier today, I asked him, what's the biggest priority of the ministry? And he said that this issue of understanding and building technology of these territories in a way that makes sense for the indigenous groups. So not necessarily in a militarized language, but in something that emerges from the way these territories are used and understood. He also mentioned the issue of indigenous education, as he mentioned here in the lecture, and this goes from school education to higher education, to how to ensure the entry and the maintenance of indigenous students within the school systems, the university systems, to ensure that they can come to foreign universities and study and learn. He also mentioned indigenous health, be it in these areas that he mentioned today of indigenous lands that have been invaded by illegal mining and that today are contaminated by heavy metals, but also situations in his home state in Mato Grosso of indigenous mental health, of the mental and spiritual well-being of indigenous peoples, health in a holistic sense. And then I might finally add the topic that I've mostly been working with as a consultant to the ministry, which is the issue of environmental stewardship and the extractive industries, which is a topic that has a lot to do also with this country, because we do have extractive industries from this country that are active in Brazil and that are active close to indigenous lands. And how do we ensure that the political and territorial rights of indigenous peoples are fully respected by the legal, ethical, and economic commitments of
Maybe we will take some questions now. Actually, I will be contacting, sending emails to the largest view community in the coming weeks. We are going to set up interest groups, like we already working with Rural Development Institute for Rural Development Program, that will be applying for funding to IDRC. And sure, there are many other opportunities in which you are more than welcome. Education is critically important. And we also, actually, I have been pushing and likely to come, a special ELAP students, for indigenous students. It's not going to be actually for 6 months, it's going to be for 12 months. And it's going to be open in all the areas. Eloy will be in Ottawa on Friday, and they're going to have meetings there with Kaike and Gasparini, that's why they're here, to push, because they just recently signed an agreement with the French government, by which is actually a great number of indigenous students at their doctoral level are going to France to do postdoctoral studies, all part of the PhD thesis there. And the experience has been extremely positive. Indeed, actually, you probably read in the news, Carnegie is going to come with very tough budgets. But one thing is not likely to be reduced, actually, is international collaboration. At least I am happy there, because they see that actually with the United States withdrawing funds for a lot of things, Canada has to play a more active role. IDRC also developing some projects that I had been exchanging information with some of the members. So there's a lot of opportunities. There will be also, perhaps in the evening, I extend a visit to the VIEW administration to specifically come to Brasilia in the coming year. We can actually just perhaps take already some proposals, clear proposal for collaboration. But we are doing very well, actually. We are receiving a lot of students from Brazil here. We are receiving from FAPESP, which is actually is a foundation there. We had Amanda, who just passed her qualifying examination. A fascinating study on the deforestation, comparative study deforestation in Brazil and Canada. So she was in British Columbia as well, looking at it. So there's a lot of things that we will be working together to advance. There's a program coming, and I hope actually this time we're going to apply. We're working hard with the Rural Development Institute here, particularly is the global skills. Global skills for me is a critical important program that we missed our chance to apply 3 years ago. And that is actually funds traveling or Canadian students to developing countries up to 1 year, fully paid. And I'm going to push that particular program to have a very strong indigenous component there that actually we all can benefit into that. So I'm going to stop here. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to it. Perhaps Anna, you can come here.
Yeah, sure.
Yes,